Thank you and good afternoon. I was speaking with Garth last night and we kind of thought we might have had this order a bit in reverse because I'm kind of probably going to bring it back up a level after we've heard some really interesting projects happening both here in Australia and overseas, but bear with me and hopefully there's my clicker. So I work for Arup, as it was mentioned, and have to do a quick sales pitch. What Arup does, we large international global consultancy, 14, nearly 15,000 people across the world, and generally our waste and resource recovery services are divided down into consulting activities and infrastructure activities where we actually help sort of design, build and deliver projects. We work sort of across our client bases, everything from local governments, state governments, federal governments, through to developers, waste companies and contractors. So there's the sales pitch over. Okay, so where are we at with the current state of play for energy from waste in Australia at the moment? Well, at the moment, I'm going ahead of myself. At the moment, we do actually have about 1.2 million tonnes per annum capacity of energy from waste, and it's predominantly composting or anaerobic digestion. We still do not have any thermal energy from waste for municipal solid waste, commercial, industrial or C&D waste in Australia, although there are projects that have been approved. Some examples of residual organic waste is within the closed cycle, has been used to produce energy is happening. A very good example is the Australian Tartaric Products Facility in Victoria, which is utilising spent grape marc as a feedstock for their biomass boiler, and they're using that to produce steam, and then so they're putting that into through driving an organic Rankine cycle system, and then that's generating the electricity for their own internal consumption, and it's a completely closed-loop system, producing about 90,000 tonnes per annum of products. So so there are examples out there, but in terms of waste streams that we traditionally work on in this room, we don't actually have any yet. But there are a large number of projects under development, and this is a sample since when I even wrote this slide about a month ago. Things have changed. We heard from Matt and Garth about the ARENA funding of the feasibility study for Mount Piper, which is fantastic. But if we look sort of generally, these are sort of the most spoken about projects. We obviously have the Dial-A-Dump facility in Sydney, which we heard earlier from Ian. Boral Cement have actually been approved to accept RDF into their facility in Berrima, which I think actually was the first ever project approved under the Energy from Waste policy in New South Wales. Omega Energy in the Hunter have a series, but they're going back in for a revised series shortly. The Foy Group, which is the waste plastics to biofuels facility, is under review at the moment in ACT. You have the Yarra Valley AD project, which and there's the Tartaric project, which is already I spoke about, and then we have, which we also heard about earlier, the Southern Oil facility, which is part of the JJ Richards Southern Oil project in Gladstone, and then in WA there's actually 4 projects that have been approved. You have the Phoenix Energy, the New Energy Corporation facility, ERMC actually have a project approval for their site, and then there's the proposed Martin Biopower with Suez and Monadelphous facility as well as part of the ERMC bid, and then there's the other New Energy facility in Port Hedland. So they're all the projects that essentially are in the pipeline in Australia at the moment. Some of them. Okay. So, globally, what's driving energy from waste and what has been driving energy from waste to date? Well, globally, environmental concerns is one of the key things, and particularly in emerging nations that's happening. If you look to Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Mexico City, all countries that are all proposing energy from waste, it's environmental concerns and public health concerns, which are 2 of the key drivers there. Resource sufficiency is definitely is one of the key drivers. In Europe, it's really and Japan, land scarcity and sort of limitation on on land, so not wanting to develop landfill, and cost. So again, when you start driving, when you look at land scarcity in particular, and so costs will come into play. So it can essentially be, be more cost effective. But then if we look to Australia, what are the trends in Australia? Well, as I said, currently in Australia, we actually don't have any thermal energy from waste for the three key main waste streams, MSW, CNI and C&D. But I believe there is increasing public demand for greater resource efficiency and not sort of completely reliant on landfill. We have, over the last few years, had a changing regulatory policy to support energy from waste, and some state, particularly with the New South Wales state policy and the WA policy as well. Federal and state government support for renewable energy industries, and it's very hot at the moment. I think Matt mentioned CEFC say it's between 3.5 and 5 billion. I'd like to think I've heard them say it's 3.5 to 7 billion over the next 10 to 20 years. So there's definitely a very viable industry. And then Australia looking to adopt international practice. I mean, Australia is certainly, for a first world country, not having any thermal energy from waste here at the moment would be behind international practice. And then sort of looking at landfill levies and other fiscal measures that are incentives that are promoting it as well. Now, this is very much my take on it. This is not based on anything, but just my opinion. Where are we at the moment in Australia in terms of energy from waste? So I believe people in New South Wales, there is definitely a feeling that the energy from waste policy could be viewed as an inhibitor. I've certainly, Garth and Regroup here today has said that it's not, and there's others that believe it's not, but there are some people, particularly people who are involved in emerging technologies, may consider the requirement to demonstrate tried and trusted and proven technology using similar waste streams in a similar jurisdiction as a difficult hurdle to overcome, and then the diversion requirements on their table one. In Victoria, there's very much an organics-based focus at the moment. There's a lot of discussion around anaerobic digestion and composting and dealing with the food waste, while sort of larger scale energy from waste is potentially sort of not being spoken about as much. They feel under pressure to increase their levy, but they're sort of trying to resist that a bit at the moment. Queensland without a levy is always a challenge, but there is the Biofutures Plan and the Biofutures Roadmap. And certainly the Queensland Premier, I live in Brisbane, some people you know, Anastasia Palaszczuk, I think she's viewing this as her legacy piece. She would like to, she believes there's a $1 billion industry that can be grown in Queensland. It can create business, it can create employment. It's very supportive and complementary to the regional nature of large parts of Queensland, and also it can grow on sort of the existing skills and experience they have with the sugarcane and the biogas industry. South Australia has an increasing level. We all know it's going to go to $100 a tonne by 2020, but they also have the circular economy platform, which they're driving, and we're all awaiting the paper or their platform piece that's due out very, very shortly. So it'll be interesting to see what that's got to say. WA actually have, they have approved 4 facilities, so they're certainly leading the way in terms of development approval and sort of state support of energy from waste plants. Getting the first one to financial close will be the next hurdle that has to happen. And then ACT recently have announced this transition to zero waste emissions by 2050, and they have gone out to industry looking for market sounding for a whole heap of different activities that can support that, and of which sort of the bioenergy area is a key part of that, and energy from waste will come into there, potentially sort of looking at advanced waste treatments. Northern Territories and Tasmania, I don't know, anyone who wants to provide us with an idea what's happening there? I would be delighted to add some words of wisdom onto my slide. So happy to be challenged by any of those at the end. It's just purely what my take is. Okay, so technologies, if we look at thermal energy from waste. Realistically, we have a whole heap of technologies. We have new and emerging technologies going down through plasma, gasification, pyrolysis, gasification, and then looking at great incineration. And really, when you start looking at those technologies, we do go from, the least proven down to the most proven. Detlef said, we have a large number of reference facilities for moving great incineration. As you start, gasification, there's a lesser number, pyrolysis, lesser number, and so on and so forth. If we start looking at those three those three technologies, the three main ones being pyrolysis, gasification, and incineration. Well, what's the key differences between them? Well, essentially, very simplistically, pyrolysis is the combustion in the absence of no air. Gasification, there's partial air, but not enough to fully combust the waste. And then incineration or moving grade technology or fluidized bed is actually where there's excess air, sufficient air to ensure the complete combustion process. But essentially, what are they all doing? They are all extracting the embedded energy from the waste, and that's why it's known as waste recovery. Okay, so we had a much more complex diagram from Martin, but essentially, most energy from waste plants, it's a simplified three-stage process. It's the waste delivery and the waste acceptance. Then we have essentially the thermal treatment and the energy generation in the middle. And then we have, if anyone's ever been in an energy from waste plant, the vast majority of the plant is actually given over to the actual flue gas treatment and the management of the air emissions. Okay. So, on to how can we make these projects succeed in Australia? Well, first of all, we really need to learn from international experience, and we need to learn from what has gone well, what hasn't gone well, and what really didn't go well, and what is the ugly. And also look at what have they, what in terms of what else has happened in Australia, sort of overseas. And sort of one of the key things actually, and key trends happening now internationally, is actually the architectural treatment of facilities and what are actually these facilities look like. And a lot of the times, as we heard earlier, they are co-located within urbanized areas, so therefore their architectural treatment, is actually important. So this gives us an example of sort of a number of facilities globally, including the cathedral in Denmark. We really need to understand the technology and understand, sort of what you want to use. So understanding sort of, how this technology is going to work for your proposed waste streams. Who are the providers, and what are their track records? And also key, I think, for Australia, have they any experience of working in Australia, or what's their understanding of the Australian market, and how can they deliver a project in Australia? Certainly, I had a conversation with somebody yesterday with regard to bankability. Do you need to have a named technology provider, to get to financial close? And certainly, unless, realistically at the moment, you would need to be there or thereabouts with your technology provider defined and agreed, prior to reaching financial close. Next really is understanding and knowing your waste streams and the composition of those waste streams in detail. And this will require doing detailed compositional analysis and really understanding everything that's in that waste stream and potentially what's in the waste stream that can cause a problem. And then when you determine what's in the waste stream and if there are potentially components of that waste stream that could create an issue, whether how are you going to get it out and actually demonstrate, very, very clearly describing and demonstrating how you're going to get it out. I noticed on regroups on Garth's side earlier there was a comment about PVC and sort of the technology that they will employ to ensure that there will be no PVC within the RDF feedstock. Again, it's an issue. It's a potential oxygen-forming material. It's something that the regulatory authorities are going to be interested to know how you're going to manage that. But there's a lot of other components that you just really need to provide very, very clear definition of. And I'd really stress this, that this can be a real challenge sometimes in Australia. So information on waste streams and waste composition can be difficult to get, and but it's something that will need, there's a requirement to invest in that. And then the next part of that is when you work out what the waste streams are and the composition of, well, you actually need to consider the availability of that feedstock over the duration of your facility. So this really is modelling and forecasting, and this is looking at growth projections within your catchment area, looking at competing facilities, who else could be drawing on, or sort of trying to draw on that same feedstock, and then also looking at state diversion targets. So looking at current diversion targets but future diversion targets, and actually mapping that out and undertaking sort of quantitative modelling to sort of demonstrate that the feedstock is available for the duration of your project. Next is considering size and scale. This is the new Dublin waste energy facility from my hometown in Dublin, which is under construction, a 600,000 tonne facility. And finally, 20 years after it was first mooted at council, it accepted its first waste last week. And it is an impressive facility. It is large and it is big, but it's also, and it went through huge scrutiny in terms of its size and scale, and in terms of determining its appropriate scale. But really taking into consideration the material availability and your location, it's really what is the optimum size for your facility, and then modelling and demonstrating that that size is appropriate, and looking at sensitivity analysis, looking at different sizing and different scenario testing to do that, and actually providing that as evidence as part of your process. It's really important to consider changes and disruptors, and we're living in a really dynamic world at the moment. There are huge changes and disruptors happening all the time. I mean, I think of the Uber example, the poor taxi drivers, whoever thought Uber was going to come along and just wipe out basically their entire industry pretty much in sort of a case of sort of 6 to 12 months. But solar is another sort of big disruptor for the energy market at the moment. The circular economy is an interesting one, and how that will interplay in with the energy from waste market. The EU has released a paper around sort of the relationship between the circular economy and energy from waste and how that can happen. But I noticed yesterday I got an email through to say Apple now wants all our phones back. So producers are now sort of saying, well, actually, we don't want you to throw it away as waste. We want it back. So how could that impact, your waste streams, your waste composition, and your waste availability over the years? You also have to think about legislation, what changes in legislation could happen, and also elections. So, I live in Queensland. Perfect example is we had a levy, we had a change of government in 2012. The first thing they did was they abolished the levy, and that sort of impacted the resource recovery market in Queensland very significantly since that point, and also probably results in 1 million tonnes of waste a year coming up over the border. Social licence and taking the time to build confidence, trust and understanding in the community. It's really important that you engage early and you engage often, and you really take the time to inform stakeholders. This is something that everyone in this room, fundamentally probably understands what I'm talking about, but the vast majority of the population, they don't understand it. And, particularly in Australia, people still have very poor memories and connotations for the word incineration or even energy from waste. So we need to be bringing people on a journey. When I did the Dublin facility back in sort of the mid-2000s, there was 5 years the local office was in place within the community, sort of on an ongoing basis, building sort of the knowledge base up of that community that was now housing that facility. So you need to bring people on the journey with you, and you need to be sort of informing them and educating them and working with them to sort of answer their queries and engage with them. But also, I really believe is you need to also make these projects attractive and acceptable and more acceptable to the community. And, sort of how do we, in terms of siting a facility, so particularly if you're going to be drawing material or drawing feedstock or waste from a sort of a greater area, well, how does the local community benefit from sort of something that's sort of servicing a greater community? So in Europe and in Japan, they look at sort of community gains. What can be gained by the community? So potentially it's a piece of social infrastructure. In Japan, it's very common to be having swimming pools schools or some form of sort of, some sort of, as I said, social infrastructure. Europe, district heating is very, very common. I know certainly in Denmark, sort of communities will nearly compete, against each other to have a facility house because they want to be guaranteed to be getting, sort of their heating and their hot water for a set price per year. Community funds are contentious, but certainly, they do provide a benefit to the local community. They can be seen as some people potentially see them as a bribe, but however, again, if you put a set amount levy in Ireland, it's very common. You put a price per tonne on, and that money gets put together in a community fund that's given back directly to the community, and for them to use within their own community activities, be it sports, schools, sort of community libraries, etc. So we really need to start thinking outside the box, and how do we make these projects more acceptable and attractive to the communities that is going to have to house them. And finally, I really believe you need to seek a champion. You need longevity to get an energy from waste plant up. As I said already, the Dublin facility has been 20 years in the making, and there's a large number of other facilities that have taken a very long time. You need somebody who's going to have the staying power, who's going to champion your project. So be it the Lord Mayor, or be it a developer, or somebody from whoever it's going to be, but somebody really needs to lead it, front it, and champion it, and have the stamina, as Mr. Usain Bolt, who as he said, his 3 minutes of gold medals took him 15 years of training. So you can get there in the end, but it's having someone to champion it and work your way through. Okay. So that's me. It's just a quick run through, and there are my contact details if anyone needs to contact me. Thank you.